Darth Vader is one of the most iconic villains in pop culture, but what truly shaped him? The fear of failure, when left unaddressed, can create invisible monsters. Anakin Skywalker's journey reflects the complex psychological dynamics of family and unresolved trauma. What if what led him to the dark side wasn't just a thirst for power, but the fear of being insignificant? Get ready, what comes next may completely change the way you see the Star Wars universe. Anakin Skywalker was born on Tatooine, a desolate planet where the golden sand seemed to swallow any hope for the future. The arid vastness of his homeland mirrored the loneliness and desolation that marked his life from the very beginning. His mother, Shmi Skywalker, a slave without freedom, gave him the only source of affection and protection, but like everything on Tatooine, even that connection felt fleeting. Anakin's life was shaped by the struggle for survival and the constant sense that the world around him was a cruel and indifferent place. For children like Anakin, who grow up in adverse conditions, building a solid emotional foundation becomes an immense challenge. Family psychology explains that the early years of life, especially initial interactions with parents or caregivers, are crucial for healthy psychological development. A child who does not experience emotional security may grow up with a deep sense of insecurity, feeling that the world around them is not trustworthy. Although Anakin deeply loved his mother, he lacked the emotional stability needed to cope with the challenges that lay ahead. His childhood was marked by a constant need to prove his worth, not just to others, but especially to himself. When Anakin was discovered by Qui-Gon Jinn and taken to be trained as a Jedi, he was, unknowingly, searching for something more than just a chance to escape the misery of Tatooine. He longed for belonging, for a place where he could be more than just a lost child in the desert. But what he didn't know was that by being taken away from his mother and everything he knew, he was taking a critical step towards something he couldn't fully understand. The beginning of a psychological journey that would eventually transform him. Although the Jedi represented the possibility of a new life, Anakin would soon realize that this new path did not offer the emotional security he so desperately needed. The theory of attachment, proposed by psychologist John Bowlby, suggests that when a child experiences significant ruptures in the bond with their primary caregivers, they may develop a distorted view of themselves and the world. For Anakin, the separation from his mother was the first of these ruptures. It wasn't just a physical loss, but a profound emotional blow. The absence of Shmi left a void in Anakin's heart that, no matter how much the Jedi welcomed him, he never felt he could truly belong to that new world. This emotional void transformed into a constant fear, the fear of loss. Anakin no longer wanted to be abandoned. The pain of being separated from his mother, which he carried silently, began to manifest in his relationships and his worldview. He feared that any bond he formed would be temporary and inevitably destroyed. This fear, nurtured by the trauma of his childhood, would make Anakin vulnerable to the influences that would soon enter his journey. The environment Anakin found himself in, especially within the Jedi Order, also contributed to the complexity of his psyche. While the Jedi represented a path of discipline and self-control, the Jedi philosophy of detachment and emotional distance seemed like an antidote to what Anakin most needed: emotional connection and security. The lack of understanding and the constant demand to control his emotions only increased his anxiety and insecurity, creating a vicious cycle in his mind. He began to question his own ability to deal with his emotions and the challenges of life, which led him to seek answers in increasingly darker places. But there was something no one saw coming. This fear of failure, of not being enough, began to shape the way Anakin saw himself and the world around him. In his quest for acceptance and to fill the emotional void left by his mother's absence, he began to adopt a win at all costs mindset. He needed to be the best. Not just to prove his worth to others, but to prove that he wouldn't fail. This drive, fueled by his fear of failure and loss, would soon turn into something more sinister. Modern psychology suggests that in many cases, the fear of failure, when left untreated and misunderstood, can lead a person to make drastic, even self-destructive decisions. Anakin's fear of being abandoned, of not being enough, led him to believe that the only way to ensure the safety of the people he loved was through absolute control. However, this control, desired with such good intentions, would become the seed of what would eventually lead to his fall. The fear he felt of losing, of being abandoned again, began to take form, turning into a monster he could no longer control. The world around him, which initially seemed full of promise, began to reveal its flaws and limitations. Anakin was about to discover that even with all his power, there was still something far stronger that he could not control, the inner demons that haunted him. Fear, when left unaddressed, was laying the foundation for what would become his transformation. He just didn't know it yet. Anakin's transformation was not instantaneous, but rather the result of a series of small ruptures that unfolded throughout his journey. When he was accepted into the Jedi Order, there was a renewed sense of hope, a possibility of escaping the shadows of his past. However, the Jedi Order, which initially seemed like the answer to his anguish, began to place Anakin in conflict with his own deeper emotional needs. The harsh training, the imposed discipline, and the constant denial of the emotions he feared most, anger, fear of loss, the desire for control, became an unbearable burden. Everything began to unravel when Padme Amidala, the woman he loved, reappeared in his life. The feelings Anakin held for her, the only person who seemed to understand his suffering, awakened a new desire in him, the desire to protect, to no longer lose anyone. But Jedi philosophy imposed limits, telling him he had to distance himself from such feelings in order not to compromise his future. For Anakin, this was a devastating contradiction. He needed love, affection, someone who accepted him for who he was, without the rules that separated him from his most human emotions. Evolutionary psychology suggests that during adolescence and early adulthood, individuals go through crucial moments of emotional adaptation and change. At this point, they seek an identity that often conflicts with external expectations and norms. In Anakin's case, this identity crisis was exacerbated by what he perceived as the denial of his humanity, imposed by the Jedi Order. He couldn't simply be a Jedi, he needed to be someone who was loved and accepted, someone who had control over his own life and choices. The Jedi's rigid view of human feeling seemed to ignore this, and Anakin, caught in this dilemma, began to drift further and further from the Order. The deepest rupture came with the premonition of future loss. The dream he had about Padme's death was the starting point for a spiral of paranoia and fear. Psychologically, dreams of impending loss are often a reflection of internal insecurity, an anticipation of what one fears might happen. Anakin, who already carried a deep fear of loss and separation, now faced a future that seemed inevitable. The idea of losing Padme, just as he had lost his mother, became unbearable. His childhood trauma, the loss of Shmi, was unresolved, he never had the chance to deal with the pain of that loss. Now, he projected this fear of abandonment onto Padme and, unconsciously, began taking drastic steps to prevent it from happening. At this point in the story, Anakin begins to transform more visibly. He starts to question the Jedi and their motivations. He feels betrayed by the Order that was supposed to be his family, a family that, in his view, never understood his pain. He now sees himself on a solitary path, where the fear of losing the people he loves is so overwhelming that he begins to rationalize that maybe he should have absolute control over his own fate and the fate of others. Psychology suggests that, in many cases, individuals suffering from unresolved trauma, like Anakin, may begin to develop a distorted view of reality, where they believe that only total control can prevent further suffering. This control, however, starts to feel increasingly like an unbearable burden. It was in this growing sense of helplessness and fear that Anakin found something to cling to in the power offered by the Sith. He believed that by mastering this power, he could prevent the losses that haunted him. Psychological science speaks of rationalization, a defense mechanism where a person tries to justify behaviors or beliefs logically, even when those choices are deeply emotional. Anakin began to rationalize his choices, believing that if he used the power of the Sith, he would be able to save Padme and, ultimately, control his own destiny. The line between good and evil began to blur for him, and at the same time, he felt he was fighting for something greater than mere survival. And it was there, at that breaking point, that everything began to collapse. The fear of losing again, the unresolved childhood trauma, and the desire to avoid pain came together into a powerful force. Anakin, who once sought salvation and redemption, now saw power as the only way to secure what he feared most to lose. The desire to protect the people he loved, especially Padme, became an obsession, and the line separating the hero from the villain was slowly erased by his own choices. Anakin's internal conflict began to reach its peak when he faced the Jedi Order's final test. The mission to confront Count Dooku was not just a military assignment, but a psychological challenge. He was expected to act according to Jedi precepts, always focused on serving the greater good and justice. But for Anakin, this mission represented more than a fight for good. It symbolized the weight of choosing between absolute control and freedom. It was a battle between what he believed was right for others and what he felt was necessary for his own emotional survival. As the war against the Sith intensified, so did the pressure on Anakin. His relationship with Padme grew more complex each day. The woman he loved seemed increasingly distant, unable to understand the emotional storm he was facing. To her, the Jedi were guardians of peace and justice, immune to ego and desire. But Anakin no longer saw the world that way. He felt that the Jedi Order, with its rigid philosophy of detachment and self-sacrifice, only pulled him further away from the people he loved. At the same time, he feared that losing Padme would mean losing his last connection to the humanity he so desperately wished to hold on to. During a mission on Coruscant, while watching Padme in a political meeting, Anakin experienced a disturbing vision. He saw her dying in his arms, and he was powerless to stop it. This vision was not just a random premonition, it reflected his greatest fear, losing the woman he loved, just as he had lost his mother. According to anxiety psychology, a person with traumatic experiences, like Anakin, may develop an anticipation disorder, where their fears intensify and begin to consume their actions. This was exactly Anakin's case. His fear of losing Padme was not only consuming him. It was shaping his decisions, pushing him down a path he knew was wrong, but that seemed to be the only one left. Count Dooku's words echoed in his mind, "The Jedi have no freedom, Anakin. They are slaves to the code. We, the Sith, possess the power to shape the future. The future of your beloved." These words haunted Anakin, and over time, he began to believe Dooku was right. His fear of loss and his desire to protect Padme blinded him to the true nature of the choice he was about to make. In the Sith, he saw the promise of a power he had never found in the Jedi, the power to control his destiny, and the destiny of others. Meanwhile, the Clone Wars grew more intense, and with them, the pressure on Anakin to make increasingly difficult decisions. His loyalty to the Jedi Order was being tested, and he found himself in a state of growing discomfort. He could no longer accept the emotional detachment the Jedi demanded of him. At the same time, the idea of serving the Emperor, who offered him the chance to save Padme, was becoming more and more seductive. In a night of anguish, Anakin sought the guidance of Palpatine, the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, who already saw him as a key figure in his plans for power. With his persuasive words, Palpatine managed to convince Anakin that the only way to prevent Padme's death was to embrace the dark side of the Force. He promised him the power to save his beloved. And, at the same time, the chance to finally take control of his own destiny. "I can help you save Padme, Anakin," said Palpatine, his voice soft and almost seductive. "The Jedi Order won't give you that. They will lose you, just like they lost your mother. What do you want? To keep living like a slave, or to become someone who can truly make a difference?" Anakin now stood before the greatest choice of his life, one that challenged everything he believed to be right. Behavioral psychology speaks of the concept of immediate rewards, where an individual, driven by an urgent desire, such as saving Padme, begins to make decisions based on instant gratification, without considering long-term consequences. For Anakin, the promise of saving Padme was an immediate reward, something he believed he could not afford to lose. With his mind dominated by fear, the desire to protect Padme, and the lure of power, Anakin made his choice. He turned against the Jedi, believing that by following the dark side, he could finally take control of his own fate. He surrendered to the Sith, and with that, began his journey to becoming Darth Vader. Palpatine's words became the truth Anakin most wanted to hear: "Power is the key, Anakin. The power to save those you love, the power to rule the future." But that choice, made under the weight of fear and pain, would lead Anakin to even greater loss, and the consequences of his surrender to the dark side would echo across the galaxy. He didn't know it yet, but by making that choice, he was walking toward the abyss. Anakin Skywalker's defining moment arrived abruptly, yet inevitably. When he knelt before Palpatine, accepting his offer of power and pledging allegiance to the Sith, he crossed the point of no return. The transformation from Anakin, the promising Jedi, to Darth Vader, the most feared servant of the Empire, was now complete. And with that decision, he irrevocably distanced himself from the light, not just from the Jedi Order, but from himself. The vision of Padme, still alive, was what sustained him through the entire process. She was the reason behind everything he did, the justification for surrendering his body and soul to the dark side. Anakin genuinely believed that his love for her justified any sacrifice, that his choice of power was the only way to keep her safe from a tragic fate, like the one he had witnessed with his mother. But, as attachment psychology suggests, Anakin's love, fueled by his deepest fears, became a destructive obsession. Meanwhile, the Jedi desperately tried to understand Anakin's true nature, but he had already closed his eyes to their warnings. Obi-Wan Kenobi's attempts to dissuade him from following this path, speaking about the importance of detachment and trust, fell on deaf ears. To Anakin, Obi-Wan's words increasingly sounded like an attempt to deprive him of his freedom. The Jedi rules no longer felt like protection against evil, but a symbol of impotence in the face of life's real challenges. The Jedi who once believed in his mission of peace and balance now saw the Jedi system as a prison. Anakin's fall was more than a simple transition to the dark side, it was a denial of everything he once believed to be true. The psychology of cognitive dissonance can explain this shift in perception. When people make choices that contradict their own values, the human brain tries to justify these decisions to reduce internal discomfort. Anakin began to rationalize his actions, believing that his dark means were justified by the end he sought, saving Padme and ensuring a future where he was no longer a prisoner of his emotions and fears. In one of the most striking moments of this transformation, Anakin confronted the Jedi at the temple, where a terrible moral dilemma awaited him. He already knew his fate was sealed, but the full extent of his choice would not become clear until he entered combat. In the heat of battle, his hands, once so diligent in defending justice, now destroyed everything in their path. He didn't just kill, but did so with calculated coldness, justifying his actions as necessary to achieve peace. Behavioral psychology suggests that emotional detachment can be a coping mechanism for trauma, but in Anakin's case, this detachment blinded him to the real consequences of his actions. Anakin's internal crisis culminated in his battle with Obi-Wan, a duel that was not just physical, but deeply emotional. Obi-Wan, still believing there was good in his former apprentice, tried until the final moment to bring Anakin back to reason. But Anakin's mind was already consumed by the need to control what fear told him he could not. In his mind, he was no villain, he was the only one who truly understood the necessity of power and control. He believed that by becoming the master of his own destiny, he could finally be free. At the height of the fight, as Obi-Wan pleaded for Anakin to remember who he was, the newly christened Darth Vader simply looked at the Jedi Master with cold, remorseless eyes. He had chosen his fate. The ethical compass that once guided him no longer existed. What he now saw were only blurred lines between right and wrong. Palpatine's words echoed in his mind, "There is no good or evil. There is only power." The shock was profound. Anakin could no longer see the line between right and wrong, good and evil. And it was at that moment, in that confrontation, that the true point of no return was reached. He had not only distanced himself from the Jedi Order but also from any possibility of returning to what he once believed to be just and right. His decision was final, and all that remained was the void of a man who had now become everything he once feared. But deep down, something within him still asked, what if he was right? What if power was the only way to save what he loved most? Darth Vader, now completely immersed in the dark side of the Force, began to reveal the true depth of his transformation. No longer the hero the Jedi had hoped for, he had become a symbol of terror, a ruthless leader who saw chaos as the only path to order. But what was happening inside Anakin's mind? How did he reach this conclusion, where fear and power became the pillars of his existence? Modern psychology offers intriguing explanations for the logic of destruction that overtook his life. In a study on the psychology of power, researchers found that the relentless pursuit of control can manifest in destructive behaviors, especially when an individual fears losing what they hold most dear. In Anakin's case, the desire to protect Padme was the initial engine of his downfall, but as he delved deeper into the dark side, that fear of loss transformed into an obsession with absolute control. He believed that by accumulating power, he could ensure that the pain of loss would never strike him again. What he failed to realize was that the very fear of losing control was driving him into a spiral of destruction. Behavioral psychology, in particular, discusses how environment and external stimuli shape an individual's actions. For Anakin, the environment he chose, Palpatine's empire, was a place where fear was fed and power was the only currency of value. He was conditioned to believe that in order to achieve his goals, he needed to crush any obstacle in his path. And, as a true product of the system around him, Anakin learned to rationalize his acts of violence and tyranny. Each of his actions, no matter how cruel, was justified by his need to protect what he loved. The logic of his destruction was not simply a desire for revenge or power. It was a desperate attempt to rid himself of emotional suffering, of the guilt that consumed him. He not only destroyed the institutions that had created him, but also the ties he might still have had to family, to friends, to the possibility of redemption. Neuroscience speaks of the depersonalization that occurs in individuals who emotionally distance themselves from their actions. Anakin, in his attempt to shut out feelings of pain and loss, depersonalized his acts of violence. He believed what he was doing was necessary, and that belief crystallized in his psyche, becoming the logic that justified every decision he made. According to cognitive psychology theory, individuals who experience extreme emotions, like the fear of failure or loss, may make impulsive and irrational decisions as a way to avoid emotional discomfort. For Anakin, each deeper step into the dark side was a way to avoid what he saw as his greatest fear, failure. The loss of Padme, the loss of control, meant his total failure. He could not allow that to happen. But by surrendering completely to the dark side, he was, in fact, creating an even more desolate reality, an existence in which he no longer recognized himself. When Darth Vader began hunting and eliminating all remaining Jedi, he did not do so merely out of loyalty to Palpatine, but because he convinced himself that it was the only way to guarantee peace. He did not see his actions as evil, but as a stabilization strategy. He believed that by eradicating what remained of the Jedi Order, he could finally create a perfect empire, where he would have absolute control over the fate of others. The psychology of control, according to some schools of thought, suggests that when an individual feels their life is out of control, they turn to power as a way to regain that dominance. And that is exactly what Anakin did. He did not seek power out of greed, but out of a need for emotional and psychological preservation. In his eyes, the chaos of the Empire was necessary to create order. But what he did not realize was that he was becoming the very chaos he feared. Every act of destruction he committed, every life he took, drove him further away from his humanity. He believed he was creating stability, but in reality, he was building his own prison. It wasn't madness. It was cold calculation. That was the thought that dominated his mind. The monster he had become was not a reflection of an irrational loss of control, but a logical, albeit distorted, decision. And it was this calculation that led him into a spiral of destruction. He no longer saw anything as wrong. The fear of failure, of being unable to save those he loved, had transformed him into a merciless machine, a shadow of the man he once was. What remains after the storm? When everything collapses and the rubble of what was once a life of promises and aspirations becomes just a grim reminder of destruction, Darth Vader's legacy is revealed in its full magnitude. The galaxy, now under the control of the Empire, had become a place where fear and tyranny reigned. But more than that, what Anakin Skywalker left behind was not just a reign of terror, but an irreversible shift in the psychology of everyone around him. Anakin Skywalker was not merely a villain in the Star Wars saga, he became the embodiment of the consequences of uncontrollable fear. His transformation from hero to tyrant not only destroyed the lives of many but also reshaped how those around him viewed reality and their own possibilities for redemption. The Empire, now a machine of oppression, was a mirror of his shattered psyche, an order born from panic, where authority and control mattered more than any other value. Those who followed him, like Darth Vader, were equally trapped in their own distorted visions of protection and order. But what remains after the tyrant falls? After the death of Palpatine and the collapse of the Empire, Anakin, or rather, the man who was left of him, was redeemed. Luke Skywalker's struggle to save his father was not just an attempt to restore order, but to restore Anakin's humanity, a man who, deep inside, still carried the pain of his losses and the weight of his choices. Anakin's legacy, therefore, was not just one of terror and destruction, but of a cycle of redemption that would echo for generations. The psychological impact of his journey, from a hero corrupted by the need for control, would continue to resonate in many minds and hearts. The fear of failure, of losing those we love, would remain a recurring theme in the lives of those who witnessed his fall. The lesson left behind for the galaxy, and for each of us, is clear. The fear of failure can transform a human being into a monster, but it can also guide us to redemption, if we have the courage to face our inner demons. Yet, the true question remains, who are we to judge? After all, each of us carries within the same fears, the same insecurities that shaped Anakin. Are we not all vulnerable to the chaos that fear can create? Is there not within each of us the potential to fall, to be consumed by our own emotions, just as happened to him? The true monster in Star Wars wasn't just the dark side, it was the shadow that exists within all human beings, the shadow born from the fear of failure. But perhaps, he wasn't the last. What happened to Anakin Skywalker is a story that repeats itself in many forms, in many lives. What he became is not the end, but a reflection of how the internal struggle against fear can destroy everything a person holds most dear. The cycle of destruction and redemption never ends, for the psychological battle that Anakin fought within himself is the eternal struggle of all human beings. And so the story continues, as each generation faces its own internal battles, with the fear of failure always lurking. Darth Vader, or Anakin Skywalker, is not just a symbol of evil. He is a reflection of each of us, in our darkest hours. And his story remains a reminder that sometimes, the greatest monster we must face is not in a distant empire, but within ourselves. Throughout this journey, the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker reveal a psychological dilemma that goes far beyond a simple tale of good versus evil. The relentless pursuit of power and control, fueled by the fear of failure, creates a destructive spiral capable of corrupting even the noblest ideals. Darth Vader was not merely a villain, he was a reflection of our own vulnerability. The monster that can emerge when we surrender to panic, despair, and the desperate need to avoid pain at any cost. Anakin's story, marked by his choices and his tragedy, stands as a warning that the fear of failure can turn us from heroes into villains, from well-intentioned individuals into terrifying beings. Yet at the same time, it is a reflection on the capacity for redemption that we all possess. Even after the greatest of falls, there is always the possibility of return, of reconciliation with the humanity that still lingers within us. What we learn from Darth Vader, then, is not only about power or the Star Wars he fought in, but about how our own shadows can consume us if we don't learn to confront them. And as we look at the legacy he left behind, the question that remains is this: will we be able to avoid the same fate? Because maybe, just maybe, the real monster was never Darth Vader. Perhaps the real monster is the fear that silently consumes us, the one that lives in our minds, and which, if left unacknowledged, can end up taking control of our lives. And perhaps, he wasn't the last.